So if you look at the US dollar, over the last 100 years, it's lost 95.5% of purchasing power. That is massive. All the other currencies, all the other fiat currencies like 新台币, JPY, RMB, they're always inflating. So you can't measure value with a ruler that you can stretch indefinitely, right? Like, what does $1 buy you? Less and less every year. But one Bitcoin is always one Bitcoin. And one Bitcoin will always be worth more dollars, more 新台币, or more JPY, or everything else, because those are always inflating.
观众朋友您好，欢迎收看《工商时报财经相对论》，我是节目主持人朱楚文。比特币最近剧烈震荡，从10月初的12.5万美元的高点呢，一度跌到了8万美元左右，市值蒸发了1兆美元，让不少投资人担心是不是比特币的熊市来袭。而也有人质疑，比特币号称数位黄金，真的能够具有黄金一样的韧性吗？同时，量子电脑来势汹汹，会不会冲击到比特币的未来呢？今天我们在节目当中，我为各位邀请到了JAN3的创办人，他曾经帮助包含萨尔瓦多和许多的国家将比特币法币化，而且建立战略储备。今天他要来跟我们谈谈厘清比特币的现况和未来。他是 Samson， 由于呢他常年都住在海外所以呢今天的访谈我们将会以英文来进行，让他能够更完整的表达他的观点。我们一起来欢迎 Samson。Hello Samson, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you, Ashley.
It's great to have you here for sharing with us your inspiring perspective. And the first question, we would like to know about the future of Bitcoin. We're seeing that Bitcoin has dropped over 25% in just a few months. Some media's even called it a big crash. But it's interesting that some big institutes from Wall Street to Silicon Valley are buying Bitcoin in 2025. So we're curious about, is there any bubble risks here?
I wouldn't say so. The media likes to speak often about Bitcoin's death and demise, but it's been this way for 16 years. Every time Bitcoin has a pullback or a crash, as some might call it, then Bitcoin is dead. And then we come back. But if you look at the zoomed out price chart, in 16 years, we've gone from 0 to 126,000. So that's very rapid value accretion for Bitcoin as an asset class. And I think it's only accelerating. And in this sort of transitionary period where you're creating or adopting this new store of value, this new asset class, it's really normal to expect volatility, large volatility, and the market pricing the asset correctly. So it's not something to be worried about, in my opinion.
So from your perspective, what caused this drop? Is it just a later pullback, or will they lay the Bitcoin market to get into the bear market?
Yeah, so I think the biggest question that everyone's asking with this recent pullback is what caused it? And everyone's trying to rationalize it somehow. Yes. I think the MSCI indexing was one factor, but I believe everyone is not on the right mark. I think it's simply market sentiment. Sometimes the answer is really simple. It's not any one particular cause, but just the market was expecting that Bitcoin will move in 4-year cycles. And if you look at the past, we've had a few cycles, I think 3 now, and they all coincide with a bull run in the last year of the cycle. And then you enter the bear market. So people are kind of thinking Bitcoin has run its cycle now, and this is the entry point to the last year is the bear market. So we're entering the bear market year now of the cycle. But I don't believe that's true, because if you look at Bitcoin's price at a few months ago, 126,000, and you compare Bitcoin to, let's say, any other asset class, we're only just really beating inflation. So inflation-adjusted Bitcoin highs would probably be about 111,000 per coin. So at 126, we're kind of outperforming inflation. And this is inflation by my metric. So I measure inflation by the cost of eggs. So if you measure the price of eggs, they've gone up about 10 to 11% over the past 4 to 5 years. So that's not CPI. CPI is much lower. But real inflation is probably somewhere like 10%. So if you look at that, Bitcoin is just outperforming inflation. This is not a blow off top. It's not euphoria. It's just steady performance. And if you look at the pullback, we've been flat for the whole 2025. So we hit 100K earlier in this year, and now we're under 100. So our performance is flat. We haven't hit any big peak so far. So there are people that believe that 126,000 is the top, but that's assuming we're in a cycle. But it's a mistake to assume that Bitcoin will always follow these 4-year cycles, because it's like flipping a coin. Every coin toss is unique. So it's not a guarantee that you always have the same exact cycle. If Bitcoin is appreciating as an asset class, we might see far longer cycles of 5-6 years or longer. And if you look at the gold ETF launches, when gold ETFs launched, it was followed by an 8-year-long bull market. So I think we have to reevaluate where we are at in the quote-unquote cycle, because there may not be a cycle anymore, and Bitcoin has yet to make a run.
Lately, we've seen some Asian whales move large amounts of Bitcoin, and the market says it has a selling pressure. If Bitcoin still has a strong long-term outlook, how should we interpret these whale movements?
Well, you mean on-chain movements, like people tracking movements on the chain, right?
Yeah.
So I don't really believe that you can track what people are doing on-chain, because you don't really know what each on-chain transaction is doing. A lot of the on-chain analysis is based on the presumption that every movement is a sale. Every movement of coins to an exchange is a sale. And I think this also contributes to the recent sell-off, because the on-chain analysis is saying old holders are selling. But you can move your funds for a number of reasons. One is you're moving it to a new wallet. You want to increase security. You want to set up multi-sig. Or you're moving it to a custodian, perhaps. Or you're moving it to an exchange to take a position, maybe a leveraged position. Or you're moving it somewhere to borrow against Bitcoin. But there's so many reasons that you can't really say every on-chain movement equals one sale. So I don't believe it's something to be worried about. And like I said before, the fear is that people are moving coins, but people always will be moving coins. And the other fear is that we've hit the cycle top and now it's a bear market. So these are kind of the reasons why I believe there was this sell pressure. It's recent buyers, based off of data points that I have and people I've talked to. It's people that bought within the last year selling, really.
So if we look long term, where do you think Bitcoin's price could be by 2030s? And should we worry about 2026 without a halving boost, just like a cycle you mentioned?
Well, I have a price model that I use on a lot of the nation state work. Like, we have to make projections. So it's based off of 60% median annual growth. So every year we grow about 60%.
60%?
Yes. So if you look at that, by 2030, we should be roughly at $1 million per coin. But I think that's a very conservative model. I believe we'll see it far higher than 1 million by 2030, maybe even next year or the year after.
Okay, so strong long-term value brings up another question. Bitcoin is often seen as a protection against hyperinflation and the fiat collapse. But what if neither happens and the US dollar remains dominant? Does that limit Bitcoin's ability to prove itself as a real money?
Well, it's really up to us to decide what money is. If you look at the history of money, it's not a government saying something is money. This is fiat currency. It's money by decree. But in the past, it's people trading with one another saying beaver pelts are money, or beads are money, or silver coins and gold coins are money. And it's the same for Bitcoin. We just decide that Bitcoin is money and we start using it. And now you can see governments are starting to become interested in Bitcoin as money with the creation of strategic Bitcoin reserves, with the creation of laws for making Bitcoin legal tender, or just favorable laws about Bitcoin in general, such as paying your taxes in Bitcoin. So really, the definition of money is defined by the people, and then the governments want it. If the governments can define money indefinitely, it'll always be a money that they can print. So given that money right now is something that can be printed, you have the detriment of inflation. So if you look at Bitcoin, it's really just a piece of software. It is code, it's math, and it combines math with energy to mine and produce Bitcoin. But it's simply a piece of software that says there's 21 million units. Nowhere in the code does it say Bitcoin is money and you have to use Bitcoin as money and pay people with Bitcoin and spend Bitcoin and save in Bitcoin. It's almost like it's a energy-based ruler that says there's 21 million units. And if you look at it from that perspective, it really can't fail because all it does is create this fixed measuring stick of value. And if you look at all the other currencies, all the other fiat currencies like US dollars, Sing Taibi, JPY, RMB, they're always inflating. So you can't measure value with a ruler that you can stretch indefinitely, right? Like, what does $1 buy you? Less and less every year. But one Bitcoin is always one Bitcoin. And one Bitcoin will always be worth more dollars, more Sing Taibi, or more JPY, or everything else, because those are always inflating. So if you look at the US dollar, over the last 100 years, it's lost 95.5% of purchasing power. That is massive. So if you wanted to buy something today that was worth $1 back then, you have to spend $18, $19 in today's money to buy something worth $1 100 years ago. So you can see there's a big problem with the fiat currency. So it's almost like Bitcoin can't fail because the fiat currencies are failing so rapidly. And I think there's an interesting exercise that maybe your viewers can try at home. But you can ask an AI like Grok or Claude or some AI agent to research for you what is the purchasing power loss of the NT, the New Taiwan dollar, since inception. You don't need to believe me. You can ask the AI and it'll do all the research for you. But since NTD was launched in 76 years ago, it's lost 98.8% of purchasing power. So you have to ask yourself, what will the purchasing power be in 100 years? And again, you should ask AI that too, because it'll calculate the answer for you. But the inflation rate in Taiwan is something like 6.6%. So push that forward 100 years, you'll lose another 86% of purchasing power. So Bitcoin really can't fail because everything else is broken.
Yes, just as you mentioned, Bitcoin has its unique value, but lots of people worry about another thing, that is quantum computing. So how do you see the threats from quantum computing? Will they affect the future of Bitcoins?
So Bitcoin is very interesting. It's a 24/7 global marketplace. So whenever there's fear in the markets, like there's a war about to happen or something like that, Bitcoin usually drops first, and then the traditional markets when they open up. So in a way, Bitcoin is sort of a punching bag for the world because it's online and liquid and 24/7. But in other aspects too, there's always concern about Bitcoin, like you mentioned the quantum concern, like what if quantum computing kills Bitcoin? But I posted something on X a few days ago that Bitcoin is not in danger. Bitcoin is the danger because you shouldn't be worrying about Bitcoin and quantum computing when there are so many other problems that will be caused when quantum computing actually works. But first of all, quantum computing is not a threat so far and probably won't be for another 5-10 years. Quantum computers can't even factor 21 right now without some heavy customization of the algorithm. But if we did have quantum computers, let's say tomorrow, that would destroy the traditional financial system. All the banking sector would be wiped out. Stocks, trading, everything would be broken. All the encryption used in those systems would be broken first. And it's difficult because those are not, they don't have such a straight upgrade path like with Bitcoin. So for Bitcoin, because it is decentralized and it's software, we know what paths we have to fix the quantum threat, to mitigate the quantum threat. We just have to write the code, and then every node on the network, individuals like myself and others, update our software, and Bitcoin is now quantum resistant. But you can't say the same for the traditional financial system because every bank has different systems, different code bases, different security practices, and there's millions and millions of banks around the world, all with varying levels of software sophistication and security. And you're not going to fix that as simple as the Bitcoin network can fix itself. So my advice is, if you're worried about quantum computing as a threat to Bitcoin, you should first worry about the traditional financial system and even military systems, right? Because nuclear launch codes will also be broken with quantum computing, and that is also a threat. But it's really interesting how the media only focuses about Bitcoin and these things when there is so much other threats that quantum computing can take down.
Now let's connect Bitcoin to the financial system today. We have a question. As more countries develop stable coins, that is really a hot issue in Taiwan and in everywhere. Will they help Bitcoin adoption, or will they strengthen the fiat system and limit Bitcoin's role as real money?
I see stablecoins as a mid-step to hyper-Bitcoinization. So hyper-Bitcoinization is the point at which you no longer need to sell Bitcoin. You can just live on a Bitcoin standard. You don't need fiat money anymore. But stablecoins, what they do is they're banking the unbanked, especially stablecoins like Tether. So they're serving the clients that banks don't serve because they cannot serve them. There's too many people. They can't onboard them into the banking system or the traditional system. So stablecoins are giving access to dollars to people in the developing world, like Latin America, Africa, Turkey. But what they're doing is teaching people how to transact with digital assets using QR codes. So it's sort of paving the way for Bitcoin. And for us at Jan3, we develop a wallet as well called Aqua. That puts Bitcoin at the top of the wallet interface, showing it as a savings account. But we also support stablecoins too. So in a way, stablecoins are educating the world on how to use something like Bitcoin. And they may choose to swap into Bitcoin to save money. But it doesn't really compete with Bitcoin, not in the long run, simply because the stablecoins are still based on fiat currencies. So if the US dollar continues to lose value, eventually people will realize that
stablecoin is not believable.
it is believable, but it's not a solution. It is a temporary fix. But governments are oddly very interested in stablecoins these days.
Yes.
And I think maybe it's because it's more safe. Because talking about Bitcoin, there is risk. And I think that perceived risk of Bitcoin is probably the biggest barrier to adoption. Because they don't want to risk their careers and speak about Bitcoin. If Bitcoin fails, then they'll look bad. But blockchain, stablecoins, these are safe things to talk about because it's just an abstract concept and a safe technology. A stablecoin is just a digitized fiat currency. So there's no real career risk that it fails, at least not in their view.
If Bitcoin is money, then let's look at it from a national level. Do you think Bitcoin can become a national reserve asset? We're seeing President Trump recently sign an order to create a strategy Bitcoin reserve in the US. Do you think this will push other countries to hold Bitcoin?
Definitely. We're seeing many other countries with Bitcoin reserves now. There's Bhutan, El Salvador. The state of Texas recently bought $10 million worth of IBIT, which is the Bitcoin ETF. And there's more and more countries putting forth legislation. So even in Taiwan, we're working with Dr. J.C. Ko, a legislator here. And he has been pushing for the Bitcoin reserve in Taiwan. And the premier and the central bank in Taiwan have agreed to study the feasibility and potentially launch a pilot project to create a reserve in Taiwan, similar to the US. So I think it's a matter of time. But if you look at, or if you ask yourself a question, why do countries have gold reserves? Like, why does Taiwan have gold reserves?
Because we believe that gold is valuable.
Yeah. So it's the same thing. People are starting to understand and believe that Bitcoin is valuable. So it's a natural extension of that countries will also have Bitcoin as part of their national reserves too. But it's also a very strategic thing. So if you look at what we talked about before, the loss of purchasing power of fiat currencies, and you think about Bitcoin as a strategic asset for a country, it's actually very important because you want to be able to buy, let's say for national defense, military equipment, fighter jets, submarines, drones, and all those things. Don't you want to have an asset that will retain value over the next 100 years? If you're only relying on fiat currencies, then you'll be able to buy fewer and fewer defense weapons in the future. And I think that's why Taiwan has a very large store of gold. Taiwan has 420 tons of gold. And I think in 2024, I was presenting in a conference here. I said Taiwan should buy 83,000 Bitcoin because the UK has 300 some odd tons of gold and they have 60,000 Bitcoin. So if Taiwan has more gold than the UK, they should have more Bitcoin than the UK as well. And the number I calculated was 83,000. But if you think about it, if Bitcoin is going to keep becoming more valuable, it makes sense that you should buy sooner rather than later. And Taiwan spends roughly 2.5% of GDP on defense, military spending. So if you're just willing to spend 1.25% of GDP on buying Bitcoin this year, you'll have 83,000 Bitcoin. And that is a very good sized reserve for a country, I think.
We know that you play a key role in making El Salvador to make Bitcoin legal tender and to make Bitcoin reserve. So from your perspective, what role does Jan3 play in helping countries, including Taiwan, build Bitcoin and a blockchain strategy? What strategy suits Taiwan?
Well, I think the simplest one is to create a reserve, because I believe there's already an understanding, like you said, that you want an asset, a solid asset. That's why you have gold. But for us at Jan3, our goal is to engage with governments, regulators, politicians, and educate and support them to either create a reserve, pass Bitcoin-friendly laws like creating Bitcoin legal tender laws, or building infrastructure for them to use Bitcoin in some way. Potentially financial instruments as well, like Bitcoin bonds. So there's many things you can do. If you think of Bitcoin as the future reserve asset of the world, then there are many opportunities there. Payments is just one, but storing Bitcoin as reserve, mining Bitcoin, creating new financial instruments like government-based debt, sovereign debt backed by Bitcoin, I think that's going to be a big driver in the future.
And then let's stay with the idea of principles, especially decentralization. That is the characteristic of Bitcoin, right? As more government increase regulation and increase their power in the Bitcoin market, do you worry that Bitcoin's decentralization narrative could be weakened?
I think that is a valid concern. People do worry about countries having Bitcoin. But like we talked about earlier, I think anything that is valuable, the government will eventually want. So it's inevitable that the government will want Bitcoin. But Bitcoin is a proof of work system. So it doesn't really matter if one country has 10 million Bitcoin, because it's not a vote, it doesn't impact the network, right? And even at a mining level, like if a country has a significant amount of hash rate, it doesn't matter because that can always change. So you can increase the size of the pie. So let's say mining is this much right now, and let's say, I don't know, China has 50% and the US has 50%. Well, Taiwan could build ASICs and increase double the mining hash rate, and then it cuts everyone to 1/3 or something like that. So Bitcoin is not beholden to anyone that holds an outsized amount of Bitcoin, or even having an outsized amount of hash rate too, because you can always increase the amount of hash rate, securing the network. But I think as countries start to adopt Bitcoin and they start to mine Bitcoin, it actually makes Bitcoin stronger in a way because it'll be more decentralized. If every country in the world has a small mining operation using excess energy, then you actually spread out the mining hash rate. And I think countries are slow moving, so they'll they'll kind of set up the mining operation and forget about it. And it'll just be humming along, processing transactions, creating blocks. And I think that's the best case. So it'll help ossify the network.
How if a country, for example, the US created a new crypto that follow Bitcoin's principle exactly, do you think it could ever reach Bitcoin status? Will it happen in some day?
Well, that's kind of a question like, will any other cryptocurrency replace Bitcoin too, right?
Yeah.
And I just don't think it's possible. Bitcoin is the original. Everything else is a copy. And everyone can make a cryptocurrency. You can make a cryptocurrency. Neil can make a cryptocurrency. It's very easy. And this is exactly what people are doing. They're launching new cryptos, new altcoins all the time, trying to emulate Bitcoin. But there's only one original Bitcoin. And I think more and more people are understanding that. If you look at the ETFs, now you have altcoin ETFs, right? You have all sorts of ETFs for all sorts of small projects, all sorts of crypto projects. But the bulk of the volume is still with Bitcoin because it is the only one that is decentralized, permissionless, and neutral. And the neutrality is probably the key thing here. So you're saying, what if the US made its own Bitcoin-like project? It would not be neutral, right? The thing is, for a global reserve asset, it must be neutral. Gold has lasted for thousands and thousands of years because it is neutral. If you invade another kingdom somewhere and you take their gold, it's just as good as the gold mined in your kingdom, right? It's not controlled by anyone. It is bearer. So if you have that gold, it's now your gold. And it's the same for Bitcoin. Bitcoin is just Bitcoin, regardless if it's mined in Russia, mined in Japan, mined in Brazil, it doesn't matter. So if the US created its own Bitcoin, it would likely be controlled by the US, or it would be heavily influenced by the US because they created it. And other countries would not embrace it because it's not neutral.
So that's the difference between crypto and Bitcoin, right?
I think that is one of the big reasons. Every other project is led by a founder that can influence it and change the protocol. And for a neutral, immutable asset, it should not be changeable or very, very difficult to change without consensus. But if you look at all these other projects, they're upgrading all the time. They're more like tech companies or like science projects. They're changing all the time. Whereas Bitcoin is just energy money. Like gold is metallic money.
So you believe in Bitcoin, but you don't believe in crypto, right? Can I conclude this?
The thing is, everyone can make a cryptocurrency, so it's not unique. So Bitcoin is the only one that is actually very interesting. And I think all the crypto projects try to say they are like Bitcoin, right? If you look at the marketing for every project, they're emulating Bitcoin. They have a white paper. They rename the things of Bitcoin, like the units of Bitcoin, the blocks of Bitcoin. They all have their own copies of the Bitcoin system to look like Bitcoin when they're not Bitcoin.
That is really important. And now moving from national adoption to everyday life. We're curious that what real challenges do you see in making Bitcoin usable in daily life? For example, Bitcoin's price moves a lot. So how do shops and stores price goods in Bitcoin?
Right. So the evolution of money usually is as it is first a store of value, and then it is a medium of exchange, and then it's a unit of account. So Bitcoin is still in the store of value and medium of exchange part. I would say it's not fully a unit of account yet. We're not pricing things in Bitcoin because Bitcoin is still repricing the world. So we've gone from 0 to 100,000, and we're going to continue increasing to 1 million and 10 million and 100 million. So if you're pricing everything in Bitcoin, you have to constantly reprice your goods every day, which is why right now it still makes sense to price things in fiat currency because it's still in a state of flux. But using Bitcoin as an everyday payment mechanism is just becoming easier and easier. So there are a lot of companies like us that build wallet software. People can spend Bitcoin everywhere. We have a Visa card, the Dolphin card now, so you can spend Bitcoin over the Visa payment network. And then in the US, Square recently launched Bitcoin on their terminals. So you can take your Bitcoin wallet and pay at any Square merchant, like millions of merchants in the US, and they can receive either dollars or Bitcoin. So you can see like all the pieces for Bitcoin as a mass payment network are already in place. It's just a matter of people opening up and turning it on and using it.
When more people use Bitcoins, what's your advice for newcomers entering this space?
I think the first is don't be distracted by everything else. There's always new projects, new cryptocurrencies. Just focus on Bitcoin. The second is to really understand money. I think a lot of people these days don't understand what money is. They're born into a fiat world. They think the bank is normal. Like keeping your money at the bank is normal. Seeing a number on a screen representing your money is normal. And you never really have to take responsibility of your money. Whereas with Bitcoin, it's a bearer asset. It means if you have it in your hand, you have it. It's like physical money, which is supposed to be gold, right? Before the peg was broken. But if you have one gold coin in your hand, it is your gold coin, right? And you have to take responsibility. You have to store it and secure it yourself. So I think people have to really understand what is money and not take it for granted that money is a number in your bank account. Because if that system breaks, then you're kind of going to be in a very difficult place. And this is why we do what we do at JAN3, to try to create more Bitcoin understanding, but implement these parallel systems in place. Because we honestly believe that the fiat monetary system or the legacy system will break over time. Okay. And the safest thing for the world is to be able to understand and use Bitcoin. So there are examples in history, recent history, about demonetization events. That's when the government pulls certain bills out of circulation. So in 2016, I believe, in India, they pulled some of the rupee notes out of circulation. And there was mass chaos because people would line up at the bank to try to change get rid of their old bills. And then there were actually people that died during that transition. And this is not a catastrophic failure of the fiat system. It was a planned removal of some bills from circulation. But some people were waiting to pay at the hospital for some procedures, and the hospital would not take their money. So you can see that preparation is very key. The people need to understand, the governments need to pass legislation that allows them to use Bitcoin, and the technology systems need to be in place for people to spend and use Bitcoin. So I think what we're doing is preparing the world for that situation, which will be a better outcome than just a sudden shutdown of the fiat system and everyone is scrambling, trying to understand how to use Bitcoin.
Great. And finally, let's end with the investment side. Now that anyone can buy Bitcoin through ETFs, so do digital asset treasury companies still serve a meaningful purpose today?
So the ETFs, I think, do serve a purpose, as well as like companies, digital asset companies like Strategy. But I don't really like the term digital asset company, digital asset treasury or whatever, because that's a new term to embrace the altcoin treasury companies, which I think will all fail because the altcoins are failing. The treasury companies for altcoins are largely constructed to prop up the asset, to create artificial demand for the asset. You see this for Ethereum, for Zcash, everything else like that. The treasury companies for those things exist to prop up the failing asset. Whereas with Bitcoin, it's more about the companies are embracing Bitcoin to protect themselves. That is the core thesis of Michael Saylor. If you listen to his early discussions about why Strategy started buying Bitcoin, it's because he realized the dollars that he's holding are losing value. He alluded to it as a melting ice cube, losing 10% a year, similar to my inflation analysis. So you're holding on something that's losing value at 10% a year. So he's moving it to Bitcoin, which is protecting himself. And that is where the digital asset treasury companies were born. And I think that's important to distinguish. But going back to your question, ETFs serve a purpose. It's for people that don't necessarily want to hold their own Bitcoin, and you're paying a fee to them to hold it on your behalf. And there's a trade-off. It's like holding your money in a bank. If the ETFs are not able to function anymore, like say quantum attack on the traditional stock market, it all shuts down, then let's say the data is erased, nobody will know how much Bitcoin you have in the ETF because the data is wiped now. So there's value in holding Bitcoin, spot Bitcoin, bearer Bitcoin in your own wallet, hardware wallet or software wallet that you don't have with holding it in an ETF. But the ETF serves an important purpose, which is it is a portal to traditional money. So a lot of previous Bitcoin bull runs, we've kind of, the bull run sort of fizzled out because the exchanges were not able to onboard people quickly enough. And that is not the case anymore with the ETFs because it's aggregated buying. So when you buy it on the ETF, and BlackRock or Fidelity, they're making one big buy for everyone else. So there's no bottleneck for money to come into Bitcoin now, which is actually very, very bullish. And if you look at companies like Strategy and BSTR and others, they're kind of like ETFs with a hedge fund on top. So they're actively raising capital to accumulate more Bitcoin, whereas an ETF sort of is a simple vehicle. You buy $1, they'll buy $1, right? You sell $1 of Bitcoin, they'll sell $1 of Bitcoin. But I think this is why companies like Strategy are valuable. They're augmented Bitcoin. They will go up more when Bitcoin goes up. But the caveat is if Bitcoin goes down, they might go down more than Bitcoin too, which is scaring some people now. But you can't have it only one way. You have to be able to handle the acceleration on the rocket ship. So when Bitcoin's down, treasury companies may go down a bit more. But when Bitcoin is up, they may go up more than Bitcoin because they're actively managed.
Thank you, Samson, for your inspiring perspective. Thank you.
Thanks, Ashley.
谢谢 Samson 带给我们非常精彩的分享啊！我想透过 Samson 的视野呢，也让我们看见了比特币它真实的价值。那虽然市场会动荡，但是呢，在整个的金融体系还有政府的未来的发展趋势上面，比特币应该都会是有非常重要的角色。那也欢迎您可以留言告诉我们您的想法。谢谢您收看这一集的《工商时报财经相对论》，欢迎您可以按赞、订阅，还有分享我们的内容给更多的朋友，一起来了解这些议题。谢谢您的收看，我是楚文，我们下次再会喽，拜拜。